Hey everyone, and welcome to Game Dive, the show where we do a retrospective conversation on one game each episode. I'm Perry, and this week I'm joined by my usual gang of Cam, Mark, and Evan. And this episode we're going to be talking about the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. So Skyrim is, of course, the massively successful fantasy open world RPG from Bethesda Game Studios. You might have heard of it. First released on November 11th of 2011, and it's been re-released a handful of times on PS4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and for VR. It's been recorded that the game sold well over 20 million copies, although there aren't exact figures. It's probably a lot higher than that. Anyway, this is really it's a huge game, and it's reached a huge audience, and it's really brought a ton of people into the world of the Elder Scrolls, myself included. I hadn't played any before this one. And it really is a phenomenon in the gaming landscape. You have people who don't really play video games that much that like this game. You have people who had never played Elder Scrolls who like this game. And of course, you have the core audience, which is just eating it up for the most part. And it's not often that you have a game that is like this widespread in its appeal, whilst also being this large. And I think a lot of that is owed to the accessibility, which we'll definitely get a lot into that a little later. But to start us off, maybe we'll go over to Evan and just give us your impressions on the gameplay.
Well, now you say we're gonna talk about the accessibility a little later, but I might start talking about that a little bit now, but
You're allowed to.
yeah, I think that the gameplay as a whole, part of the reason why the game itself is so successful is because it's so accessible. And overall, I mean, with all the, complaints one might have or hear about the gameplay, I think it is fairly successful. I think it works for the most part in most situations. I think the low skill floor on a lot of the in-game mechanics really allows anyone, regardless of their gaming background or regardless of what types of games they're into, to actually get into it to a major extent and really creates fans of the series. Otherwise, I mean, realistically, we're talking about a game that's from 2011. There's been re-releases and remasters and special editions and all of the above. So it's changed a bit from the beginning, but overall, I think most of it stayed about the same in terms of the actual gameplay, but maybe evolving a bit over the years. But even now, I think the gameplay is a bit aged. It's I don't think it ever was, top of its class, at the time that it was released or throughout the time it's been re-released, and I think it really speaks to how good a game it is that despite any shortcomings in the actual gameplay, it's still a massive success, which most people consider a incredible game.
Yeah, even when this game came out, I mean, the combat was never really a masterclass. It's never something that's never been done before. But there's something in the beauty of its simplistic game loop that just allows you to keep going through it without it feeling like it's wearing thin all the time. And especially because there's so many different ways that you can interact with the simple gameplay loop that it really helps it feel more expansive than it really is.
Yeah, and I think especially, for your first playthrough, which if you're into the game, it's gonna be tens to hundreds of hours depending on how you play. For that first time, I don't think it really gets old. It doesn't get tiring for the most part. I think on second and, later playthroughs, it does become a bit more obvious, the lacking gameplay when it comes to combat, let's say. But even now, I mean, I'm on my second full playthrough, and while it is frustrating sometimes, for the most part, I'm still enjoying myself.
Yeah, it is, as you say, like the replays kind of show the chinks in the armor a little more. But I mean, if you've already put in, a well over 100 hours into a game and are then getting bored of it, I think that that's totally fine. Like that doesn't detract from it too much.
Well, it's funny because I've played this game to death. Like I've played a lot of Skyrim over the years. I've played it pretty well since it's came out, and then had I don't know 2 years off, and then oh maybe I'll pick it up for a little bit here and there. And it's weird how even after all this time, the last time I went back and started playing with it was recently, and I know what I'm gonna get out of it, but somehow it feels less stale every time I come back to it. Obviously, it gets stale pretty quick. And one of the things that makes it get pretty stale pretty quick is some of the difficulties. As soon as you start to get the higher levels, or if you go to higher difficulties, wailing on the same enemy with your same sword through the same dungeon all the time, it gets really, really tiring.
Yeah, absolutely. There's almost too much of this game for its own good, considering the core gameplay loops and kind of how simple the combat is. But again, like it's not even really a problem for any of us, I think, or most people who play it. And just going back to like how, I guess, how or why this game is so accessible for most people, I think it really just comes down to like you'll never really be playing this game and find yourself confused with how like the mechanics work. It's all pretty basic. Like, you'll be in Helgen and you'll pick the lock on one of those cages right at the start, and it'll say, lock picking increased to 16, and then you see a little blue bar fill up on your screen. You're like, okay, cool. And then, you see that blue bar fill all the way and you get a level up, and suddenly it's like, they didn't have to explain that. It's like pretty simple.
Yeah, maybe the genius isn't necessarily in simplicity, but transparency in that sense.
Yeah, and it goes further than that, I think, a lot further. If you think about a lot of traditional RPGs and even old Elder Scrolls games, they're a lot more complicated in their typical RPG presentation. So, like character sheets and stats and, debuffs and all these really kind of higher concepts. But in this game, you have your weapons that have a damage stat and your armor that has an armor stat. And it's like, that's it. It's simple. You don't have to open up your character sheet. There isn't one, first of all. But you can't open your character sheet and be like, oh, I've got 23 defense and like 42 attack and like 83 dodge or whatever. Like in Dragon Age or Dark Souls, and in those games it can be pretty daunting. Like if you look at those and you'll just be like, I don't know what I'm looking at. These are just numbers.
Yeah, I'd say the thing that Skyrim gets very right is it's intuitive. I think that's a good way of thinking about that simplification of, in-game systems. You put heavy armor on, you expect you're gonna be heavier, it's gonna be harder to move, but you're gonna take less damage. Put light armor on, the opposite. Dual wielding weapons, you're gonna do twice the damage, you can't block. Range stuff, different arrows are better depending on the make of them. It's a lot of it is just intuition. You see that, and it's very easy to understand what that's going to change. Though I will say, in terms of debuffs, in my recent playthrough near the beginning, I hadn't realized, and I don't use magic often. And I went into the menu for magic and spells, and near the bottom, I don't remember the name of the menu, but it shows you any buffs or debuffs you have because they are still in the game.
Yeah.
And it turned out that I had a disease that I'd caught from, a rat or something, and and a skeever, and it's like, I didn't know that. I had been debuffed for, like, hours, and I was entirely unaware because the only way you can tell is people start saying, like, "Oh, you don't look so good," whatever, but there's no obvious thing or obvious there's no intuitive way to tell that you're diseased or debuffed aside from NPCs saying it and then you going into a menu to see what it is.
I think when you first get like attacked by a skeever, like if you get poisoned, it'll like briefly pop up in the top left corner saying, "Oh, you've been,
Yeah, if it did, I missed it.
yeah, exactly." Like it's an easily missable thing.
Yeah, and for a game that seems so in tune with making things intuitive and easy to understand, it would have been good for there to be a visual indicator of it somehow, whether it's your, the hands in your character model if you're in first person, or something about how you move if you're in third person. It's just something that would make it a bit obvious.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. For how elegant and simple the menu is, that is, yeah, maybe a little bit of a misstep.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they would have to just add another prong, but I don't know. You've only got four directions on there.
I think it comes down to they could do the same way they have it now, where they kind of have the activity log in the top left corner, where if quest items get removed or added to your inventory, or you get a disease or you get buffs from certain things, they kind of scroll through that top left area. If they were to find a better way to make that more seen, I understand their design choice to put it up there to make it not so distracting from the actual combat, but some of the stuff in there can be kind of important where if you miss, i.e., that you contract rock joint or something like that, and now your stamina is hampered or your health is hampered. It can be annoying to find out, hours later that you've been playing with this debuff the whole time when all you had to do was just go find a shrine and press A on it.
Yeah, that's the situation I found myself in.
Like I know in like Fallout, if you get a debuff, you can easily just open up your Pip-Boy and then like it will show like an icon or something detailing. Like if they were to incorporate that for like the next Elder Scrolls, I think that'd be really nice and handy.
Yeah, well, the kind of body overview that you have in the Pip-Boy was a really nice way
Hmm.
of showing, well, what the damage to your different limbs and your total health was, but also just based on the expression that your guy had, is a very quick and obvious tell that
Yeah.
something's up.
Well, here's a question. Should this game have had like a character sheet, like where you could see these kinds of things?
I don't think so. I think that an effective way to circumvent that would have been made it more clear in your own character model, while you're moving or idling or anything. They could have added slight animations or some change that would have made it obvious whether you're moving in first or third person.
Maybe even just constant reminders in the top left corner, like every
Yeah,
so often, it would
that
be
would have
like
been
you're
an easy
suffering from the
fix.
effects of
Because I
whatever.
remember in Oblivion, like there was like a character sheet where you can actually see like what passives you have on you or what debuffs you have on you like detailedly. But I think they got rid of that for more of a simplistic UI.
Yeah, and I just mean that given that they didn't need the complex UI and UX to convey these in-game functions, they could have done it through animation and through other things, and it not something that would have taken too much to implement. It's if you have rock joint, make your guy walk funny. It's simple. And you're like, why am I walking funny? And then you can go some you can hear an NPC passively say, "Oh, like, you don't look so good. You should go to a shrine to, pray for better health," or something. It could have been something as simple as that that would have gotten the entire loop across in a entirely simple in-game experience.
Right.
I also think Oblivion needed more of a menu system because it just was more complex of a game as a role-playing game in general than Skyrim. I mean, it had tons of stats, right? Like agility was a stat you would increase by just jumping in the around the map. It had a lot more in-depth RPG elements to it. I think Skyrim's menu system really hits the nail on simplicity head really well, with a couple of shortcomings being that there's no real way to organize your inventory, or if you have like miscellaneous weight that you can't figure out what's weighing you down, you kind of have to search through all the different tabs in your inventory just to find out, where's the heavy stuff on you. And you start to compile a large list of potions or soul stones, it can become very tedious to sort through it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The, list display that they use that's purely alphabetical could have absolutely done with, other sorting options just to make things a bit easier. But I'd like to actually jump back there, something you'd said, and talk about how leveling actually does work in this game, where based on the actions you're doing, you're improving. So, if you're using a single-handed weapon, you improve your single-handed combat stats. If you're jumping constantly or sneaking, you're improving the sneaking stat. If you're using heavy armor, that gets better when you're in combat. It's an incredibly clever way to include leveling mechanics without just getting a blank level and the game saying, okay, now pick what skill you'd like to do. And it allows natural specialization and stuff that you're using.
It's definitely a lot more, I guess, freedom compared to the previous title in Oblivion, where you actually have to select 10 ability scores. So like you have to like choose like, oh, like you definitely know you're gonna level up one hand, like you have to have that as like one of your 10 class skills. And then
I think it was 4, wasn't it?
was it 4?
Yeah. Like I think at the start of the game, you would pick 4 skills that are like your character's main skills.
Yeah, it's much more of a traditional role playing experience, which is where I think Skyrim creates a much more, I'm going to be using this word a lot in this game, I think, intuitive
Right.
system.
Yeah, because like in Oblivion, like I remember like you going through, the tutorial, and then eventually you have to like pick a class or you make a custom class essentially. And then like in this game, it's like, oh, if you want to like one day you want to just go sword and board, sure. Next day you want to do archery, why not? You can do it without having any restriction, and it all still again levels you up instead of like, oh, I have to level up these major skills in order to actually level up and
Yeah, and I'd
progress.
I'd say that the one downside to the system is, well, you were saying you could switch to, to a different, means of combat or a different skill at any point. If you're later in the game and you decide that you'd like to switch your main, combat type, so you wanna switch from archery to, double-handed weapons, you have no skill points in that, and you're coming up against enemies and, different mobs that are leveled to where you are in whatever skill that you've been using up until this point. So while you can say maybe go back and try and farm skill points in a new combat path, it's not necessarily entirely forgiving and free to do it because you just get to a point where you're too weak if you switch, which, maybe makes sense. You can't train your whole life in one thing and then suddenly go to something else and expect to be just as good.
I think that's kind of what they were going for. Like I guess that point is what, like around level 40 or 50 that you're kind of getting gated from other
I'd,
skills.
I'd say even lower than that. I'm level 30-ish in my playthrough right now, and if I wanted to switch to two-handed, I'd be in for a bad time.
I think you're only gated to a certain amount. They do a nice thing in the skill trees where all the skills that increase your damage or proficiency in that skill are the first one in the skill tree. So it is more accessible, but you're right that it does become not more tiresome, but it requires more skill ups for the level up and before you can actually start putting points in there. So when you're at level 40, level ups come a lot slower unless you're finding some way to farm
Mm.
skill levels and get legendary skills rolling. And another thing I'd say into transitioning, double that goes for trying to play Magic or transition into Magic. First
Oof.
off, Magic in this game is sort of just bollocks in general because in order to do so, you need so much goddamn mana. You have to put every friggin' skill point you have into mana. And
Magica.
then when you do that, you can cast spells, but you have 0 health, so you just die. And if
Yeah,
you don't do it, you have more health, but you have 0 mana, so you just die.
yeah, it never felt like a great, system, or necessarily as deep as it should have been, but I think the problem there might have been that they, maybe this is the point where the accessibility and the freedom went into it, like, turned into a bit of a downside where they couldn't flesh out the magic as much as they'd wanted to, or, the system as much as they could have.
I kind of find it a bit ridiculous. Like just magic in general in this game, you look literally just you select a spell and then you just palm it into people's faces. It's like, oh, okay,
It's not
here's my
exactly
palm.
exciting gameplay.
Yeah, it's like, oh, here you go. Look at fire blast coming out of my hands.
Yeah, I think once you get to, like, the later level spells, then they get fairly, flashy, but up until then, yeah, it's sort of just the Force, but
Well, a
chilly or
main
hot.
problem with it is right off the bat, it becomes difficult to use magic. Later on, it becomes very viable to use magic, and magic is actually super powerful. But the problem is, before you get to that point where you've built up enough magic and you've built up skills and you have some items that reduce magic costs or increase your magic stat or its replenishment, you're likely just to kind of go into something else instead. So you really have to actively be trying to be a mage, like
Yeah, it
very
kind of seems
actively.
like a way that they've tried to gate it in sort of, it's a late game payoff. If it were strong from the beginning, why would anyone pick anything else kind of thing? So, your magical pool is terrible at the beginning, like you said. You can barely get through combat trying to use spells without, just running around for half the time waiting for it to refill or popping 10 potions and pausing combat to do it.
Well, that's the thing. It's tough at the start with just magic, but this is almost, I think, why they did it this way is that you can have your magic in the left hand and then have like a mace in the right hand, and you can kind of get through those earlier parts by using something else that you're maybe not planning to use the whole time. Like use your one-handed or use some archery just to get through some parts that you couldn't.
But you generally need to have your skill points going into things that help you survive in melee combat if you're going to do that, or even if you're just using restoration in your offhand and a single-handed weapon in the other. Like you can pop your restorations, but unless you're putting damage and you have decent armor and stuff, you're not gonna be able to use the magic. So the problem is, unless you have great enchantments and stuff, you're not like the magic feels very subpar.
Yeah, it almost feels to me like right now it's like I'm playing and a lot of the time some of the loot that I'm finding is different robes that buff your magicka or your spell damage or costs like crazy. Like they seem like, not low level things. And the fact that I'm still finding these constantly when I'm not specialized in magic at all almost makes me feel like the devs intended it to be a switch later in the game where, you got enough equipment where it seems like, wow, this would be strong or viable, and then focus on transitioning into it.
It's possible, but the other thing with robes is certainly you can cast alteration magic to increase your armor value, but unless you have robes that decrease the cost of alteration spells, you spend almost half your mana bar on alteration spells, and there's no way you have enough to properly fight out the rest of the fight without popping potions.
Especially because like they also have like a cooldown. They only last for set amount of time, and then it's like, oh, I have to pop the spell again, and then waste all my mana, and then have to regain that back.
Yeah, I mean, it's about balance, I guess, but it's the question of whether it was successful or not. I mean, I know that there was one point in my playthrough where I was, raiding some fort with full of bandits, and there was one room where I'd walk in and it was like highwaymen or it was a higher level bandit, and as soon as you walk in, there's no way to sneak because there's two standing there, and then once they notice you, a third runs in. And I must have gone into that room like 20 times trying to defeat it and get through it. And about halfway, I realized, oh, I could try using magic and buff myself, use some like trap spells and whatnot. And I found that once I tried to use one of the more powerful spells that I had, I didn't have enough magic for it. So it barred me from even using it because my meter wasn't high enough. And I think I had to put a point into something and then it was possible. But it's a nice system to, supplement your others, but I'd never found myself trying to main it in the first place, and that's one example of why, you get to points where your good spells are just, you can't afford to use them.
Well, I think that also comes into a conversation about how some enemies in this game are just much too strong for you to defeat at the point that you come to them at. Quite often, due to how simple the gameplay is, you'll either be strong enough to defeat these things, or you just
Yeah,
won't,
there's not
and they'll
necessarily
kill you in three
not
hits.
necessarily any skill expression in the combat.
Well, I'm glad you guys pointed out because I find that the stealth mechanic and archery are like the more in depth gameplay compared to the
Yeah,
other
I think
two
the
combat
meme is
styles.
that everyone goes stealth archer.
Oh yeah, did you get like that 3 times sneak bonus thing? It's like you just go to town just sniping fools from afar, or like you just sneak up to someone, just instantly kill them.
Yeah, what I really like about the like decentralized like class system, I guess, is that you never had to feel like you couldn't use magic or you couldn't pull out a bow and try to sneak around. And I remember the first time that I played it, I was playing mostly just a two-handed Argonian warrior, but I also carried around a bow and would sometimes sneak just because you could get some easy levels by doing that. And it seemed like that was kind of almost the encouraged thing to do because you would level up more quickly if you were also doing your alchemy and also doing your smithing and enchanting and casting candlelight every so often to buff your alteration and that sort of thing, even if it's not your intention. And I think I'm thinking they did this to, I guess, kind of promote like leveling, or I guess get you kind of hooked on it, because it is quite addicting, at least for me. Like, you'll see that you're just a few levels off of leveling up to your next thing. You're like, oh, maybe I can go mash some flowers together or build a couple iron daggers, and you don't even have to go fight anyone. You're just pressing A and a bunch of
I
minions.
remember I spent like a good like few hours abusing the old Iron Dagger glitch before
Yeah.
it was patched out. I was like, oh my god, this is so like I'm gonna get so powerful from just doing this all day long.
Yeah, I think at that point it comes down to should they create the game, with a goal to allow the player this easy skill progression and power fantasy so they can get to something very fast and be able to abuse this new power, or should it be almost more realistic, if you could say that, and require much more training and practice in whichever, mechanic you're doing, like the smithing, where, the easiest way to level is to abuse the, system and get to a point where you can create things that are actually worth creating. Otherwise, you're creating weak stuff for most of the game, and I think that also comes down to balancing where they might have put the experience requirement for smithing a bit too high. If you're just playing it regularly without trying to, abuse the system, then it takes way too long.
What's the thing I would add? It has to flow, especially with the smithing. You'll find ebony weapons and armor far, far before you
Oh
can
yeah.
smith them or have the bonus to improve them better. And it by that time it feels like you're going back and like trying to grind this out just so you can make the things you're already just finding regularly.
Yeah.
It makes it much less of a reward and just like a okay, finally I'm where I need to be.
It should be smithing in particular should be a system where if you focus on it, you should be able to create these armors and weapons, whatever, that are better than the things you're able to just find out in the world. And sometimes you are, but for the most part, it's like you just said, you find all these things before you're at a point where you can even remotely think about smithing and crafting them.
Which can be a cool idea, but then when you're so far forward that you're finding dragon stuff and you can't smith orcish yet, that's where the big disruption comes. And part of it comes from the fact that it can be pretty hard. Like the smithing skill levels based on how valuable the item you create is. So in order to get the most bang for your buck, you're likely going to be smithing things like armor, which are very resource heavy. It's for a set of dwarven armor, it's like 5 dwarven ingots, 2 steel ingots, an iron ingot, and like some other straps. It's like
Yeah.
that's not a trivial amount of supplies to get half a level or
Yeah, I
half a
mean,
skill point.
clearly they intended for the smithing loop, including mining and refining and any part of it to be much deeper than maybe the rest of the game allows. And I quite enjoyed the loop in and of itself. And I think the idea of like finding a mine that has the right ore and then getting that ore, smelting or even just buying outright and then from there being able to go smith it into something and then whatever. I think that's a really interesting system, and I think it adds to the world of the game. I think
Yes.
it's
It's super intriguing. Even when
yeah.
you find materials that you're not even sure what they craft in, you just go, "Oh crap, I can't wait to be able to use this."
Yeah, but then, like we're all saying, is that the rest of the game doesn't allow that to work, where, loot circumvents leveling requirements and just having to focus so much, grind so much just to be able to get to crafting things that are better than what you're able to get already. It's a mechanic that should have been, more enjoyable and more used, but due to the rest of the game, I don't think it ever was able to live up to its potential.
Well, I think for smithing to make more sense as a skill, like you already said, you would have to be able to create stuff that is better than what you can just find. And I think that would have to be true across everything you create. Like, I know there's already a ton of armor sets in the game, but somehow it would have to just be like this dwarven armor that you've created has like 5 more armor points or something just to make it worth it. And the other thing that I think kind of detracts from it a little bit is, like you just said, it's cool when you find you find like a moonstone ore vein or something like that and you mine it, or you find some steel ingots in a dungeon or whatever. That's really awesome because then you can go smith some stuff with it. But what's not so cool is that you can just also buy all that stuff, usually from the blacksmith right next to the smith. And early on, obviously can't just spend that kind of money, but by the end, we're all rolling in fat stacks. Like, or not even by the end, I should say by maybe 10 hours in, you've got a pretty good amount of money going.
Yeah, I'd actually like to bring up one of the DLCs at this point, the Hearthfire expansion, because that one introduces the ability to build new houses and homesteads. And one of the ways I think that they introduced more value to the whole smithing loop was requiring new materials and new items to actually build some of these houses. And, in my original playthrough back in like early 2010s, I almost never mined and I never used the lumber mill.
It's because it's boring as hell.
Yeah, and there's no reason to. But now it's like, I was building the Lakeview Manor and it's like, oh, for the base, the quantities required increase, but a bunch of the required materials are usually on the plot of land, like clay or stone. And Otherwise, you need like iron fittings, hinges, whatever, based on what you're trying to build. If you're trying to build furnishing for inside, and it was actually an enjoyable part of it where it's like, oh, I need a lot of iron. It would actually cost quite a bit at this point to buy stupid amounts that I would need. So I'll go to an iron mine that I know about, that I've passed and that I've cleared out, run through it, mine a bunch, and then on the way back, I'll go to the lumber mill, spend 2,000 gold, get a bunch delivered. And it really fleshed out the world for me. It really made me enjoy the smithing and enjoy the mining and enjoy the lumber mill, which is, part of a town that didn't feel as alive before, using this mill and interacting with the NPC who ran it. So it was a nice introduced loop that took advantage of the existing systems and managed to improve their value in the game.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how a lot of these loops that we're talking about, like smithing and alchemy and chanting, they're skills that are almost entirely interacted with through menus, and yet we do find them fun. And it almost reminds me of Animal Crossing a little bit, in that you're really just doing these kind of unremarkable tasks, but somehow enjoying it.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to smith something in real life, I'd be sweaty, tired, and sore. But if I could,
Yeah.
experience the same, enjoyment of tending to smith something and in a fraction of the time it takes, and still get that feeling of creating something after, then it's a good system. I think it's why a lot of games use it.
And I guess to add on to that, it's like you see your character actually going through the animation of like creating something, like they're working the forge or whatnot. Definitely adds like the immersiveness that.
Yeah, the role playing aspect of this role playing game.
It's true. If you just walked up to the forge and just hit A, and then like a menu popped up and it was just like, all right, here's all the stuff you can do. And you just press A, like it would be just that tiny bit less
Yeah,
interesting.
because it still feels like there's some work involved, even if there, isn't technically work.
Isn't.
It just
Yeah.
it feigns challenge of having to create these things almost.
I like to think the big part about it is the get, and I think the get or whatever you receive, the reward, is almost the sole desire in Skyrim. And what Skyrim does so much better than some of the more recent Bethesda titles like Fallout 4, for example, where you can delve through so many different ruins for so many different unique items and cool weapons and stuff like that, that it gives a sense of exploration, or I need to explore this. I need to find what's at the bottom of this dungeon, where other games just don't really have that, where you kind of find the same kind of loot all the time. Where Skyrim had such a good diversity of quest lines, where you find out that there are these dragon priests and all different masks. Like, oh crap, now I got get all these different masks that have different facts. I got
Yeah.
to do all the Daedric quests to get these really cool, really powerful Daedric artifacts. It's really, it
Yeah,
really engrosses you in the world.
I'd even say the minor versions where, like, Red Eagle, I think, is an example a lot of people would come across, just 'cause the, book that starts the quest is quite frequently, placed around the world. It's not a strong item, and it's not, once you're past level 15, maybe it's not really worth it after. But, I had found it early in my playthrough, and it was constantly on my mind, like, oh, I want to find what this whole mystery behind this character is. And, you find a sword, and then you find a sword, and then that leads you to a hidden dungeon where if you there's like an open cave and with a little pedestal in the middle where you can put the sword in, that opens up this hidden door, and then you go in, and then it's the burial chamber of Red Eagle. And it's a really cool experience that drives you to want to explore and find out what the payoff is, and even just in terms of the lore.
It's almost weird how you wanna just collect things in this game. Even if you don't use everything, you just wanna collect it
Well,
and
it's funny you say
throw it
that.
up on a display in your houses.
It is funny you say that because as soon as I beat Red Eagle, I walked out, looked at the sword behind me, went, I kind of want that, even though it was like 20 levels under all the stuff I was using already. And I took it and put it in a display in my house.
Yep. Yep. It's because it feels special. There's so many things in Skyrim that feel
Yeah,
special.
it's Red Eagle's sword. It's legendary.
There is a weird romanticism you feel as a player when you find like these unique items in a Bethesda game, and you're just like, I can take this back to my house. I can like hold on to this
Or
forever
be like me, you
because the only copy in the
you
entire
just
world.
throw it into the chest and then
Into the
Never
Breeze
use it
home
again,
chest,
yeah.
and you go.
there you go. I have it. That's all I'm happy about. Like like how often do you ever find yourself using like any of the Daedric artifacts?
I mean,
Oh yeah,
some.
not too
I
much.
think it's the thought that if you don't get it, then you'll never be able to get it again.
It's like
You're missing out, man.
Yeah.
That FOMO hits you hard.
Like I remember getting the Wobjack at the end of Chiragarat's quest line. And it's like, oh cool. And I just threw it into their chest. It's like, yep, I have it
Yeah.
now.
I mean, there's ones like the Razor, which is, the whole Daedric artifacts are much more.
Maiden's Raise, yeah.
Yeah, they're much more valuable than a lot of the smaller quests like the Red Eagle. But even then, it's like it's really cool, and I play this assassin type character with sneak and all this, so a Razor is perfect. But it's almost like the perks you get off of a lot of these aren't as powerful as the in-game lore makes you think. Because the Maiden's Razor is crazy. Its perk is instantly killing something, but
It's
it's a
pretty good.
tiny percent. Yeah, but it's such a small percent that it basically never happens. So at that point, it's like, okay, well, that perk's really good, but why would I use that item when this other dagger is way stronger aside from that? So it almost feels like these leveled items are contradictory to what the lore and the in-game world would make you think that they are.
Yeah.
I remember using Dawnbreaker and Spellbreaker a whole bunch because I was playing more like a paladin character.
Yeah, Dawnbreaker is great. I love that item, even just in terms of like the presentation.
Oh yeah, like I remember like learning about it and like seeing like I want that specifically because like it looks like such a badass like
Yeah.
sword and shield. It's like yeah, like there's no like other unique item like this in the game compared to like oh it's another iron sword.
Quick point to actual leveled items. Certain items in the game, like the Nightingale sword and Chillren and stuff like that, are actually leveled to a certain strength when you find them, like when you enter their area or their dungeon where you receive them. And part of that feels, I don't know, it's hard to say. It's almost disappointing, really. So if you were to do like the Thieves quest or the Thieves Guild quest line early and you get Chillrend early, it's, well, you can only use it for so long until it becomes useless. Whereas if you were to come after it at, I think level 46 is when its scaling maxes out, it's easily one of the best weapons in the entire game. And you have that for the rest of the game.
You have two solutions to this problem, which is if you're gonna have a world that is this big and this free to explore, you have to imagine that a player could find like the Mehrunes dagger at like level 5. So now you need to make sure that, well, you either make sure that it's a static amount, so it'll only be this good ever, or in the case of Chillrend or whatever the other ones are, you make it so that it scales. And it's like, I'm not sure which is the better way to go about it because either way you could end up with kind of like a
Well,
bad
the
item.
thing about the Razor is that you have to get the quest line first, and in order to get it, you have to beat 2 Dremora, which are very, very powerful. So you have to be at a certain point in the game where you can defeat these enemies in order to earn the weapon. Whereas Chillman is just handed to you. It's just like it's sitting in a case. You just
Yeah,
get it.
I would argue that I think in a game that focuses so heavily on role playing is that if you found something super strong that you found something super strong, like if that allows you to main that item and roll through some of the early bit, then that's fine. You found it.
And I don't want to have this Toy Story moment where I go, I don't want to play with you anymore, and just fucking drop it, right?
Yeah, I mean, even like the oh, what's his name? Molag Bal, the mace.
Oh, the mace.
Yeah,
Dope
it's like
weapon.
yeah, so it's like it's really cool, but I found it and I already know that within 10 levels at least, or at most, that I'm gonna stop using it because it's just gonna be outscaled by everything else.
Well, but that's not so bad on principle. I mean, a game like this, you're constantly upgrading your equipment, like a lot
That's
quicker than
true, but
every 10 levels.
I think it's also a problem but when it's such a strong narrative game where these are supposed to be godlike beings and you get their special god weapons and then your ebony sword is just better later.
It's also about player fantasy, right? I want to use what I want to use more than like I have to use this because this is good, which I know is just that conflict with how pretty well every game functions. But then you should give me a way to improve this. If I want to use this like super unique, really cool looking weapon later on in the game, then give me a way to do so. I don't want to have to just get rid of it.
And I
Yeah.
think that is the solution because the other problem you could have is, like I said, you could give the player something that's too good to the point where they never want to put it down. And then in a game that is this long and has this many different items, you don't want the player to just be using one thing, even if it's really cool the whole time.
That kind of is Wuthrad. You get Wuthrad at the end of the Companions quest line, which is one of the first quest lines you can complete in the game, and it's probably top 3 strongest two-handed weapons in the entire game, and you just get it. You can get it at like probably like level 15. You can get it.
What is
so
that one?
quick.
I never did that quest line.
It's like a big two-handed axe that you can get. The Companions of Ysgramor, right? It's a cool. It's one of the 3 major quests where they have the Winter or College and Winterhold, the Mages College, Thieves Guild, and then the Companions. It's kind of like the
Fighters Guild
end
essentially.
quest reward.
Actually, it's a good segue. I think that the different quests and sort of almost which factions you choose throughout the game are a great addition. Because I've never done the Companions quest, and I'd never felt attached to it. It never interested me much, but the Thieves
'Cause
Guild
it's
always
boring.
did. Yeah, I mean, but it gives that player like you don't play Skyrim expecting to do everything in the game.
You
You
could.
play Skyrim the way that you want to, and it gives you enough choices that you always can.
Well, it's funny you say that because this game, more so than most RPGs, allows any single playthrough to pretty much do everything. And I mean, I'll tell you that my two-handed Oregonian had no business finishing the College of Winterhold Mages Guild quest, but he did because you barely need magic.
Yeah, you gotta cast ward for half the second that your
Yeah.
magic bar will hold up.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the argument there is that there should be a stronger, limits to being able to start it or complete it depending on what you've specialized in.
Well,
But
I wonder. I mean, they didn't want to gate players in that way.
yeah, I'd still think that they're like just the diversity in general is a great inclusion and is inherently better than like 2 or 3 major quests only. Just the ability to choose, I think, is why it makes it so good.
I agree, but gating off content, well, it's not exactly gated, but if someone were to have to come back with a whole nother playthrough and go through the first like intro to the game and then do all these other quests just to get to a high enough level to say do the College of Winterhold, it like starting another playthrough in Skyrim it's almost soul crushing after you spend so much time in your other character.
Yeah, I don't think it's meant to be done within a year of finishing it even. I think it's like after a long period of time, you get that urge that people who play Skyrim tend to get, and it's like, wow, I really want to get back into that.
I can definitely tell you, it definitely crushed my soul when I oversaved my one playthrough of Skyrim because I wanted to try out a different character.
Yeah, that wouldn't be much fun, but I doubt
Yeah,
that's
it's
an
like-
intended feature.
Completely accidental, and then it just destroyed me.
Yeah, no, I'd feel the same way saving over any major game that I've
I think
played
it comes
through.
down to what we sort of alluded to in our conversation about magic. It just kind of needs to be balanced a little better. Where I agree that you should have to try to spec into magic in order to use it, but I just think that you should be able to make that transition maybe a little more easily.
Yeah, maybe the balance should be more towards the mid-level stuff becomes a lot more difficult where, get the first the shallow stuff for each skill set if you feel like it. But after that point, you need to actually focus on it and really deal with it, which I think to an extent it already does. But like the College of Winterhold you're just talking about, I think it could be a lot more difficult to get into and complete just because it's like in real life, if I want to go to some college, I don't walk in there if I'm going into an art school, draw a stick figure and say, yeah, I'm good at art, or go into an engineering school and like, build a table out of 2 planks or something and say, yeah, I can build stuff.
And then a week later, they make you head of the faculty.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, it's intended to be a college. It's intended to be this top tier academic space for the people to learn magic and the best of people in the kingdom to perform magic. And in lore, if it were elementary school, it would make more sense how easy it might be.
Be a little
But
bit Billy Madison of mages.
yeah, but I think that there's often a disconnect, and even going back to what I was saying about the artifacts and different quest items you can get, there's a disconnect in what the game tells you something is, and what the actual value of it is.
Well, I think you might be onto something there. And one thing that I definitely miss from games like New Vegas, for example, just simply are like speech checks. And there are sort of speech checks in Skyrim, but not to the extent where, okay, I can't persuade this guy because I don't have a high enough sneak, or I can't intimidate this guy because my heavy armor isn't high enough.
It's more
Where in
like
New
just
Vegas,
speech options at
yeah,
least
they did a
Skyrim.
really good job of you can't progress or can't play through this way unless like your explosives is high enough,
Yeah.
which sometimes it feels annoying when you're not doing it that like doing a run with explosives that you barred off from that. But I think you're right, and it would make it feel more special if throughout the college's quest line that you had to have these skill check moments where, okay, look, you're gonna have to practice a little more before you get
Yeah,
before you can
and if
start
they
teaching
said
here.
maybe at the start, like even just to start the quest line, like they'll skill check you, like you need minimum 30 in like one magic school or something like that. Like just so you have to at least like do a little, because no character starts with 30 in any skill.
Well, actually, what's interesting is that throughout the main quest line, you're actually sent to the College of Mages or College of Winterhold, and like you can literally just do just a Dragonborn and shout. They're like, "Oh, you're okay, yeah, we can let
Come
you
on
in.
in.
Come on in."
That seems like magic. All right.
I mean, there's the whole, you're the special person, and I could see there being excuses like, oh, this guy's the next prophet. We should probably let him in and try and train him a bit. But narratively, it doesn't work that way. But I think that there could have been a more heavy-handed consequence to not specking into stuff. Like you were talking about New Vegas, and another RPG that I've been playing recently is a Divinity Original Sin 2.
Nice.
And yeah, it's a great game, probably up there with some of the best RPGs I've ever played. But it is very much that where if you haven't chosen for your own reasons to focus on one mechanic or spec into something, then there's more than a few occasions where you try to do something in the game and it's just like, no, you suck at magic. You can't make a clone jutsu. You don't get to graduate. It's not you can't do it, but it's okay. Like we'll let you anyways. And I think that really adds to the role playing
It
aspect
absolutely
where
does. Yeah.
being able to fail is important.
Well, and it's New Vegas especially, it allows your character, allows you to feel like the specializations you've made in your character are worth something and are valuable. And so
Yeah,
when
they're
you get this
significant.
speech check for like, you need explosive level 60, it's like, whoa, I'm that guy. I'm hitting. You know what I mean?
This is my time to shine right
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Yeah, it gives you a special interaction that you wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. And as accessible as Skyrim is, and as successful as that makes it, I think that's some depth that could have been added that would not have taken away from the overall accessibility of it.
Like the game definitely lenses as like, oh, you can be whoever you want, but like the only thing you are is like you are the Dragonborn, but like everything else you do, it's like completely up to you. Like it's a complete, it's your own sandbox essentially. Like, you can
Yeah.
do whatever how you want to play it. But then like with games like Divinity is like, oh, okay, like this character I want to play as, like I'm gonna make it like a warrior type character. But then it's like, okay, maybe in my like next playthrough, I want to play more like a magic type.
Yeah, and then even in Divinity, to an extent, you can change your specializations at certain points. But I think the difference is you're saying, Skyrim's like you can play whoever you want. The difference is you can play whoever you want whenever you want, as opposed to, just due to difficulty of the actual game after certain points, barring you from being able to do that. If you've decided I want to switch into this and you're, not 3/4 of the way through game and still be able to successfully do that after putting a few hours into it of just grinding levels, then yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing being told you can't just because, you know, you can't just drop your life profession or proficiency and then say, I want to do this now, and then just suddenly being able to do it.
I think it also depends on how the game is designed. I mean, Skyrim, like we've sort of touched on earlier, most of the gameplay plays sort of the same way, regardless of how you're playing or what specialties you're playing. If you're using magic,
Hmm.
if you're using bows, if you're using melee combat. So I think in this sense it does work. But I think in games like Divinity, Original Sin, using magic kind of changes how you play the game in a much more drastic way, possibly.
That's true.
That I think there's more value in keeping you typecast to one way or to one skill set.
Yeah, so maybe we're going back to the depth of combat in Skyrim is a limiting or freeing factor in a lot of the game's other mechanics.
True.
Well, you can also if you yourself want to be the warrior, then you can find a follower, and they are probably like a magic user.
Yeah, right up until you lose them,
Yeah,
and then good luck. I've lost Lydia twice now in my current playthrough, and the first time I was able to find her, but this time I've given up. There is no means of finding a follower that you've lost. Even if there was just an in menus thing saying, even if it were a quest tracker, if you were able to mark your follower and find them, or even just a recall follower option
I'm
to
sure there's a
your
mod for that
house.
at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely mods, but and I looked for one. I looked tirelessly for one, and the problem is that I'm playing this on PlayStation 4 as my computer isn't up for it, but PS4 in particular because it has its own unique issues regarding modding. There wasn't an option, and I'd argue that as great as mods are, and I have a lot installed in mine. I don't think it's necessarily a reason to justify something not being in the original or the base game
Oh,
that
absolutely not.
should be.
I can't imagine there's like, just leave that one for the modders.
Yeah,
Well, it almost seems like the modding community have allowed Bethesda to kind of
yeah.
to
And
get away.
Bethesda accepts it and says, "Well, we don't need to polish this to the extent other companies might polish their game because our modding community can deal with a lot of it." And I'm not saying that's what they're saying; it just feels like it.
It's not a Bethesda game without its bugs, right?
Eh, It's definitely part of the character, that's for sure.
Yeah, like everyone expects, like, oh, it's just a Bethesda game, good old Bethesda bugs. We'll just leave it for the modders to fix out at some point.
If quest lines didn't break and people didn't clip through the floor, like it wouldn't even be Bethesda. It
Yeah,
just
but that
wouldn't.
stuff is any other developer. That stuff is inexcusable. Like quest
They'd be
lines that break.
crucified.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Even just
That's
the
ridiculous.
physics bugs that are in this game are excessive and significantly more severe than any other game that I've played. And I think that speaks to how good a game it is that people still enjoy it despite all of this, but I
That's true.
don't think it excuses the lack of polish.
Yeah, I would agree.
So would you guys say that any of the DLC like improved on any of the base mechanics besides like adding additional quests or content?
Yeah, I definitely think so to an extent, but I don't think that one of the things that improves is combat because I think that they add new mechanics or new gameplay on top of existing mechanics, but I don't think they really ever went in and changed base mechanics. So, they've added werewolves and vampires, which have different sort of styles of play, but they still exist in the same, you know, sort of
They're not changing the
universe.
way that you really interact with the game in any meaningful way, I think. And that's not a bad thing necessarily.
I mean, people obviously love the base game enough, but the DLC is a classic DLC where it's just more of the same. It's just more quests, more loot, more characters, that sort of thing.
Which is
Yeah,
not, yeah, it's not a bad thing necessarily. I don't think
It has
every
its
DLC
place.
needs to add in completely revamp the game. But if you were itching for more content, it's good.
Because I know they like redid the entire like vampire, skill line, become like an actual vampire lord, and you can just fly around. And then with I think Dragonborn, they added dragon flying, where you can actually use them as a mount and just fly around all over Skyrim and the other zone.
yeah. So that I think is my point where they've added new sort of features, but they exist with the same mechanics. So yeah, there's vampire skills and stuff, but you're still fighting and interacting in the with the world, like with the same physics, with the same combat.
Well, it pretty much plays like a werewolf, but just with like the odd spell. So
Yeah,
it's
because you're still
still the
just
same thing.
swinging your arms, you're doing all this other stuff. So it's not like the combat system gets an overhaul just by adding these two new features.
Well, they also added horseback combat, so
Oh boy.
that really changed things up.
Yeah, now when I'm riding my horse, I think, wow, I wish this was good.
Horseback. So horses in general are just the worst, and then horseback like warfare is possibly even worse than that. So
It's just janky. It
yeah,
doesn't. I don't know why they bothered.
swinging your weapons off it feels super awful. You can't use a bow on it. It doesn't feel. It's just not enjoyable. Riding a horse in general in that game is just not enjoyable. I'd very much rather travel on foot.
I think one issue is definitely that without horseback combat, it feels like it's not right. Like, playing before it was added, you're thinking, wow, if I get in a fight, I have to stop, I have to get off the horse, then I have to fight, hope the horse doesn't eat it at some point in between. So obviously adding combat on horseback is something they should have done. But again, it just shows issues with the combat engine and sort of it was very limited.
Well, Skyrim's also one of the games where there's not a whole lot of space for horse combat in a lot of areas. You could be on the narrow pathway. I mean, there's some areas that are larger, but a lot of them have rocks or small cliffs and things like that. So it's A, hard to maneuver a horse around there, and B, it's just hard to hit things from
Yeah,
your
that's true.
horse, right? So, I mean, if they did it in a better way, well, the other thing is if you're fighting anything other than like small frostbite spiders or skeevers, you're going to want to get off your horse because you're not going to want to circle around the enemy 100 times to try and kill it.
And like half the time you're inside of a dungeon, so there's no real point of having mounted combat.
Yeah, I don't think the existing mechanics really lent themselves to mounted combat.
Yeah, it seems like the sort of thing that just made more sense to just have it in the game because you have horses already and it's a game where you swing your weapon, but it didn't work out.
I mean, logically, it makes sense, but
Yeah, and I mean, archery could have been something good for horseback combat. They've been able to do that since Ocarina of Time, flying through Hyrule Field and stuff. And, it didn't feel great there, but it worked. But I feel like part of the reason they couldn't do that in Skyrim was just the archery mechanics didn't work. Like, they didn't meld with riding a horse at the same time because actually controlling the horse is janky. Like, it feels weird, it moves weird, it's not
Like it
intuitive
doesn't feel
whatsoever.
like a natural organic
Yeah, and
extension.
then having to control, a mildly complex combat mechanic while trying not to, drive your horse into a tree or something probably didn't make it out of testing.
It was an issue in Ocarina of Time, the same thing. Like trying to aim and move your horse at the same time was disorienting and due in part to how poor the game's controls are, nearly impossible sometimes.
Yeah, and I think we've brought up Breath of the Wild once or twice, in relation to how it's learned from Skyrim, but I think that it ended up doing it right where horses have their own sort of AI, where if you're aiming a bow, they will avoid obstacles and they can follow a path if you're on a road. So I think that's probably the right way to do it in the future, but for what existed at the time, it didn't really work.
I think another reason why it wouldn't really work too well is anytime you have like a 3D space where you're aiming through it and you have not one but two moving targets where sorry, you're moving and the subject is also moving. Like it can be hard enough to hit moving Draugr in dungeons out of range when it's just them moving. And then you add in you moving as well. And if your horse has an AI where it's trying to follow paths and it's unpredictable, it would just make it impossible to hit anything from
I
the
mean, I
horse.
think it goes to show how good real life horseback archers are and have been in history. It ain't an easy task.
I think a game that like did like range combat, like not thinking about like Red Dead, but like if anyone played Battlefield 1, you can play as a Cavalier class, and you can use both like a ranged weapon, or later in one of the DLCs they added like a lance
Well, I
as a
think that
combat
also
mechanic.
ties into how fast you can kill people in Battlefield, right? Like you can go strafe someone as you're riding by them on horse, and you hit them once and they'll die. Whereas this one, you'd have to, turn around, come back at them, turn around, go back towards them.
Yeah, the horses were smarter and faster in Battlefield 1.
Yeah, not as buggy.
Yeah, and I think that you also make a good point, Mark, where how tough an enemy is, how much health they have, really does make a difference. Where it would feel really satisfying to fly in on this giant muscle beast and annihilate this enemy quickly, but in Skyrim, that just is not part of the
Yeah.
combat loop.
Where you have to add in like damage reduction or resistance, and like
Yeah, and I mean, what if you come across something that's like, a bunch of levels up on you and you just do nothing? So you, like you guys were saying, you just fly back and forth trying to bop it with whatever you have on hand and chipping it itself. It just wouldn't feel good. I mean, there's obviously a reason they didn't have it off the bat in the game, probably, and I'd imagine they added it due to people sort of saying that they wish it was in the game.
It has that neat factor. You just go, oh, that's neat, and then you just move on.
I remember when they first revealed mounted combat back in 2012 during the DICE keynote, and apparently it only took them a week. Like a dev just took a week to come up with mounted combat, along with like a bunch of other stuff that either came into the game through DLC or just never made it into the game.
Well, if that's true, it sure feels like it.
Yeah, like if they actually had the time and like actually implement it, I think, and like refined it, it could have worked.
The coder at Bethesda is like, oh, you think that's cool? I did this in an hour.
Yeah, they got a tally going of who's got the highest score.
He just points to Fallout 76.
No, I wanted to swing back to archery quickly and just mention that one thing that once I realized it made it feel a lot worse engaging with archery was that there is no damage value based on location on a target. So, it's like if you're playing a ranged unit, you tend to try and get headshots because, gaming knowledge has told you that headshots are more valuable and they do more damage.
Which is reasonable and
Yeah,
makes sense.
reasonable to assume, even without just previous gaming experience. But once you realize that in Skyrim, the hitboxes are all equally valued, that a headshot does the same as hitting someone in the leg or the torso or the arm, it just gets rid of a bit of engagement while you're using bows. It's one less thing you have to think about.
If you're trying to do the stealth bit, like you're trying to sneak through, and like, why wouldn't you want to try to line up the headshot? You have all the time in the world to make your shot, and then it doesn't even matter where you hit the guy.
Yeah, especially coming from a developer that, has the Fallout series where, which body part you hit is such a major part of one of the combat mechanics.
Even where you get hit.
And there actually would have been an opportunity for them to introduce like interesting weak points on enemies that are not your typical humanoids, like the Dwemer automatons. You could have had like interesting, I don't know, like a different spot where you need to shoot them, which isn't just the head. But
Or even dragons, assuming, every fantasy universe with dragons in it usually says that the dragon scale is crazy strong. I mean, even this game does with dragon armor, dragon bone armor. So, you could have even said that dragons could have had a unique hitbox where their scales are lighter or something, the underside or
The underbelly, yeah.
yeah.
I think the problem with that is you're hardly ever facing any side of the enemy other than the front because they're always looking at you and they're always walking towards you. So it's unless you're stealthing, it's very hard to actually see any part of the enemy that isn't the front face of them.
Unless you just have like a bunch of NPC guards like somehow taunting the dragon.
Yeah, but it really sort of harkens to the shallowness of AI behavior in general and in combat especially.
Yeah.
It's like you said, you're almost always gonna just be facing them front on because they just sort of come at you. There's almost no dynamic maneuvering or
It's almost predictable,
yeah,
essentially.
there's no mechanics that the AI employs to avoid or to get in damage. It's they just come at you, they swing, they spew magic. The only dynamic seems to feel them teleporting to either side to dodge an arrow or them running away once they get to a certain health.
And then they come back at you moments later.
Yeah. Which I also like to point out is one thing that really bothered me is that once enemy NPC starts running, saying, please spare me, whatever, whatever. Why can't you spare them? You know, this is sort of a behavior and a dialogue they've coded into the game, and you have the only option you have is to stand over them and give them that final blow. Like,
I was under the impression that you can sheath your weapons to spare them. I feel like I heard that
is it?
somewhere. It's never something I practice.
I know, like if you do a crime in a town, if you sheath your weapon, you have a chance to pay a fine or something.
Yeah, the
Right.
guards will enter dialogue with you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I might have to try that next time because I've spent my 30 levels so far in this playthrough brutally killing everyone begging for their lives, wishing I could spare them.
To be fair, if indeed sheathing the weapons will spare them, you really don't get anything from it. Unless they're gonna be like, "Oh, thank you for sparing me. Here's $100."
Maybe, but I also think that it's going back to our BioShock discussion, it's a moral choice. For
That's
me,
true.
I'm playing a character in this. It's a pure role-playing experience, and maybe I wanna spare this person because I have no reason to wanna kill them or, maybe I feel bad for killing all their friends, and maybe I wanna cause them long-term psychological trauma.
Going back to, like, discussion about AI behavior, I guess, you also notice that, outside of combat, like, a lot of the NPCs, like, neutral, I guess, in the towns and stuff, their AI is also not very fleshed out, like, their routines and the things that they'll do on a daily basis, like, they'll wake up and go sit at the tavern and have a drink for 8 hours and then go to bed kinda thing.
The American dream.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not a flaw with the game.
No, you're right. I mean, it really pulls me out of the experience, when I see that, and it is an aged game. There's obviously defenses you can give it for, AI complexity, but it really is fairly shallow once you realize or once you start paying attention. It's like you said, the AI wakes up, does their simple routine, which go to work, go to the pub, whatever. When they're done that routine, they walk straight home, go to sleep, wake up, repeat.
True, but the vast majority of AI that do that aren't specifically interesting characters. So I think in a way it kind of adds that there are characters just kind of milling around the envelope, whether or
That's
not they're
true,
actually doing a whole lot.
but it's sort of a cheat to do it that way, which you're right. It might sort of be a veil where it appears that there's more things going on than there really is.
Well, it
But
makes right one feel more alive, right? When there's actually people going around, not necessarily doing things, but just
but
existing
like
within
you
the
said
space.
at the beginning there, it's because they're not interesting NPCs. And all that it would take to make them interesting is giving them a slightly more in-depth routine or, possibilities for more varied interactions even with just other NPCs throughout their
But at that
routines.
point, you have to consider there's so many NPCs in the world.
Yeah. You also have to consider if every NPC should have a quest or should have interesting dialogue. I mean, they should have maybe one or two things to say, but maybe
Well, but I imagine that NPCs in this game are there's a fair bit of copy and paste, especially with routines and, a blacksmith in one town will be basically the same as the blacksmith in another, or,
yeah,
a lumber mill operator will do the same stuff as one in another area, depending on, geography. But I imagine their actual routine of go from house to mill to house will be the same.
Taught the Dragonborn, continue on with their
Yeah,
business.
there'll be variables of, come across the player, spew some dialogue quickly, and continue
Ugh.
on. But, assuming that AI values would be copy and pasted, there obviously would be a lot of different AI values to, pick from, but assuming that there is quite a bit of copy and paste for especially simpler, NPCs, then creating more complex sort of values for that and mechanics and possibilities for the, NPC interactions, I think would be worth the extra time in development.
maybe. It depends on the way it would play, right? I mean, if there's 20 people in each hold, I don't really even want to go talk to 20 people in each hold. Like I
Oh,
don't like I want to
absolutely,
be
yeah.
out doing other things.
But it sort of goes back to how Skyrim, and we were talking about earlier too, is, no one person is supposed to experience everything, right? But the fact that there's so many things to experience means that every single person will have a whole experience themselves. Like with Perry, fucking off at the beginning of the game and still having fun and discovering his own stuff. Going into a town, you don't have to talk to everyone, but the few people you interact with will always be worth interacting with.
Well, then make them front and center.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that would definitely take a lot of dev time to get right, and it's definitely something I hope they work on in Elder Scrolls 6. But
Well, considering how big the team is for going forward with Elder Scrolls 6.
well, considering how successful this game was, I think they can probably swing it.
Yeah, because this game was only it had under 100.
There was 93 people, I want to say.
Yeah, and that's split into like different departments.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Evan, earlier how like NPCs will spew their dialogue at you,
Yeah,
and this is something that really frustrates me and takes me out of it. Is uh, anytime you walk by most NPCs, like in Whiterun or any other town, usually they have a line that they will immediately and automatically say, and it can be really overwhelming, especially if you walk outside like a building, like you were just in the Smith, for example, and there's like 2 or 3 NPCs right there, and they immediately all start saying their line at the same time, and
yeah.
it's too much.
Or can't tell you the amount of times I've heard, I heard they're reforming the Dawn Guard. They're vampire hunters.
Yeah.
It's obviously these things are there for, or at least some of them are to start quests and make you aware of it. So you will hear in some point somehow, and you will search it out. But they come at you, and it's
Yeah.
a lot of repeated dialogue.
A big problem comes when they start to ruin quest dialogue. You'll walk into like Dragon's Reach or the Blue Palace and like try to start doing some quest dialogue, and then some other guy will come up to you and start yelling at you about something.
Yeah, no, there
Yeah.
obviously could have been a dialect priority coded in there somehow, and I assume there probably is. Whether it's successful, I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
I would have liked it if, as you say, a priority, if they had just made it so like at any one time only one NPC can be talking, like within the player's like earshot.
Yeah,
Or maybe just while you're in dialogue with somebody else. I mean, if you're walking into like that small market spot in Whiterun, maybe people be having conversations because it's actually
yeah,
important
like
to
ambient
overhear
ambient
the
stuff. Yeah.
conversations that they're having, because I mean, there's always the feuds between the Battleborns and the Greymanes, and they're always kind of feuding, and you can kind of eavesdrop on conversations, which can lead to quests. So I think it's important
Mhm.
to be able to hear ambient noise or ambient conversations, but especially when you're talking to people, like cut it to a
Yeah,
minimum.
yeah. One thing they could have done maybe was if in dialogue, deafen outside voices.
Well, didn't they do like something like that in Fallout 4?
Oh, I have no idea.
I can't remember. I
Well,
haven't played that
considering
game
the
in a minute.
problem, I can't remember if it was a problem in that game. I would imagine they did something about it,
I sure
Yeah.
hope
but
so.
it sticks out in my mind in this game as being an issue.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so maybe it's something they've improved since then, but for Skyrim, it is still a problem despite
Right.
an extra 7 years of development and DLCs and updates and patches.
Remasters on different platforms.
This I think this is something they probably could have added if they wanted to spend the time to do it, but they've probably chosen for whatever reasons that it wasn't worth, like, the value it would give to the game wasn't worth the time or resources spent on it. Despite all the shortfalls that the AI, seems to have, I think that overall, especially for a first-time player, that it does its job. I think there is definitely room for it to have improved. I think there's definitely interactions and moments that could have happened and emerged if the AI was a bit more complex, even compared to other AI implementations in games of its time and around the special edition relaunch. I think that there could have been more moments in combat and throughout just regular interaction with NPCs that would give a unique moment, something memorable. But overall, it did its job, and hopefully the next game improves upon it.
well, it better.
Yeah, otherwise, I actually want to wrangle things back into combat a bit, and I wanted to talk about enemy variety. In the fantasy genre, there's often a lack of enemy variety in many games where they'll have a few really fleshed out ones, or they'll have enough that it feels a bit varied, but eventually you start getting sick of seeing the same enemies and just mobs a lot of the time. And I think that's something that Skyrim does incredibly well, actually. There is a huge enemy variety, and it ranges from animals with the crazy killer crabs and giant rats to wolves and bears and saber-toothed tigers, and I guess dragons kind of count as animals, right? Do they? And then you get like, human NPCs and enemies, and you got bandits, you got thieves, you got all the human like the Argonian, the Khajiit, though I don't think they ever are.
I mean, they're essentially the same
Yeah, they're all
humanoid.
human-esque, humanoid, yeah. So, even in that, there's variety in difficulty. There's regular bandits, highwaymen, leaders, and then there's a lot of variety even within subclasses, and that's not even considering the fantasy elements, the Spriggans and Hagravens, and point being, there's a lot of enemy variety in this game, and it always keeps the game feeling fresh and different areas and biomes feeling more unique.
I think it's sort of from a gameplay perspective, it's sort of fake enemy variety because you're right, there are a lot of different races and types of enemies that you can fight, but the way that the actual fight plays out is like one of two different ways. Either they run at you or they keep their distance with arrows or spells.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, there definitely is a great variety in like the models and the actual things that you're fighting, like from a conceptual standpoint. But yeah, as you say, Cam, I would agree. I think it's almost meaningless.
Well, I don't think it's meaningless. I think there's great value in having like different things to look at.
Yeah, sure. But like as you say, your fights are going to play out the same way most of the time, and none of them really have different weaknesses. The only ones that you really fight differently are dragons, because
Well, even Spriggans, I mean, depending on the biome type of Spriggan, you can use fire against the base type, or whatever. But I think even compared, like, I guess I'm gonna use Spriggans as a big example in this topic, but Spriggans, Hagravens, Ice Wraith all act differently in combat. And wolves, they'll surround you, and
will
bears
they?
are yeah,
Yeah,
wolves will always surround you from as many angles as they can. Usually
Oh,
there's
I've only ever been attacked by like two at a time.
really
I always felt like the monsters and creatures, they act like how you kind of expect them to act if they're like in the real world.
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made that wolves have been portrayed as super aggressive monsters in games where in the real world they aren't, but, forgetting that for a moment,
But like going to like the trolls, for example.
yeah, they have huge sweeping attacks, and they're able to heal, and they're weak to fire, like, I think the
They vary up the combat by pouting for some reason.
well, I think the idea is
You
that
get tired and that's your time to strike.
even if the mechanics are either ranged or close combat spells, arrows, or melee, whatever, I think the way that a lot of the different mobs go about combat is unique.
I think that small section of them is
Well, no,
true.
because I think even like humans, well, there's a lot of subclasses in humans in general that all act the same for the most part. You know, humans in combat act differently than animals in combat, which act differently than trolls, which act differently than dragons. I think they all have unique aspects where
But
humans will
only
tend to.
slightly because they're all still just running at you.
Well, but they'll all, humans will recruit other people around them to help, and they'll work together. And then wolves attack in a pack, trolls attack by
That's the same thing.
themselves, and they're okay. They'll attack in a pack and attempt to surround you. Humans will only ever attack in a pack and run at you or
That's
stay
because they keep
ranged.
body blocking each other.
Well, but I think this always comes down to just the amount of enemies there are in any one situation. I mean, if you went into a camp where there was like six trolls, like in Labyrinthia, and you aggroed all of them, they would all fight you. It's just that they're not ever putting more than one there.
Well, even ice wraiths. Ice wraiths will try to attack you from far, coming close, try to attack you, swing behind you, like those have unique combat mechanics or combat, I don't know, choreography than
Behaviors.
behaviors, yeah, combat behaviors than other mobs. And maybe it's not crazy variety in terms of behaviors, but I still think there is variety.
I mean, I would say the most variety you'll get is from fighting a dragon because they fly
Yeah.
around and you pretty much need a ranged weapon to attack to defeat them.
Sometimes they'll land, sometimes they'll hover. Most of the time, they'll fuck off and fight a bear for no reason.
And like dragon encounters, they're always like sporadic and random, and like you never know when like one's just gonna come out of the blue and just like, oh, here we go, random dragon fight in the middle of the forest.
Or in the middle of Windhelm and break the quest line.
Break the quest. It's like, well, here we go. Okay.
But on the ice, no longer completable.
Oh no.
So maybe we can talk a bit about, I guess, the dungeons and I guess the lack of variety in puzzles that are kind of in them. Do you want to talk about that, Kim?
Yeah, sure. So I think at the start, Skyrim does a fine job of sort of introducing the puzzle to you with you sort of see the symbols on the walls, generally either the fish, the eagle, or the snake, and you have to kind of turn the pedestals to find them in the right way, and then hit the switch, and then if you add the right combination, the door will open. And I think it's not an awful start. It's not a bad place to start from, but it just doesn't ever feel like it really evolves from there. The only really evolution from it is okay. Now there's four symbols you have to get right, or like now one of the signs of the order has fallen off the wall and you have to sort of figure out what's in the middle, or maybe the symbols are hidden behind something. It's still just kind of in the same way that looking around the room in Ocarina of Time for an eye to shoot with an arrow is barely solving a puzzle. Looking around the dungeons in Skyrim for pictures of animals is hardly a puzzle. And I feel like it's kind of a loss because there's so much more to do with it. Or
Or
they
like
could have
when
done
you
with
have
it.
to inspect like the golden dragon claw to say, oh, like that's the combination for the door. Okay.
Now the
Yeah.
pictures are on an item.
And you
Yeah.
know what? That's not even a bad thing. Like, yeah, the first time you read it, you had to go through like Avvar's journal or something, and he says, "Oh, like I know how to get through the thing," and then you kill him. And he's like, "Okay, like it doesn't go in the door," and then you have to you can go back and you can pick up his journal, and he'll tell you like, "Oh yeah, it's the symbols on the claw when you inspect it in your inventory." It's like, oh, that's kind of neat. That's kind of a fun little way to do that, and that's not so bad because there's I don't know 15 of those dragon doors around the map, give or take. But I mean, and when it's the same thing in every dungeon of just spinning it around. Is it the dolphin, the eagle, or the snake?
Yeah, the architects in Skyrim really got together on this one.
It's like, well, we need a challenging like skill challenge right here. Oh yeah,
But
just
not
throw
too
it in.
challenging.
Not too challenging.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, I think this comes back like a lot of this is going to come back to how accessible they wanted this game to be. They didn't want I mean, they didn't want people to have to be stuck on puzzles. I mean, it sounds stupid. They didn't want people to think, but I mean, they didn't want people to, I guess, get stuck and then be frustrated.
I think that's a wasted opportunity though, because there's so
Oh, I would
many
agree.
spots in Skyrim, like so many different caves, so many different dungeons, that if like just even a handful of them, if you didn't understand, maybe the roadblock is earlier in the dungeon, so you're not backtracking through it a lot. It's earlier on in the dungeon, and it's something more complex than just missing an item. It's something you don't comprehend yet, or you don't have the tools to, and then you can go back out in the world, find the tool, then go, oh, of course, and then come back later and complete it, and then go through the rest of the dungeon. It just feels like they missed out on that kind of special uh happenstance.
It definitely feels like the puzzle aspect of dungeons in this game were not a priority. It was almost it seems like they put it in there to have this shallow roadblock as you're exploring more than being a challenging aspect of the actual completion of the dungeon. I think that you're right. There could have been way more variety in the solutions to puzzles and just possible puzzles in general, where they could have made it impossible until you found an item and almost have it Metroidvania-esque, where if once you find the thing you required for it, like even the dragon claws technically would count as that. You can't open a door without this item.
That's
And if you
true.
saw the door before getting the dragon claw, finding it and realizing would have been like a mind-blowing thing where you like, oh damn, now I can go back and continue this.
Yeah. Well, most of the dungeons they do a decent job of just putting the claw in the actual dungeon itself, right? So in the odd chance it's not there, you oh crap, I need to look
Yeah.
out for this claw now.
And just giving like creating puzzles that would have utilized different items or different requirements to complete would have been a good way to make it a bit more fun.
Yeah.
Just the variety in there. And I think that Breath of the Wild is actually another good example of another way they could have done puzzles in a good way. Get this, what is it now? 9-year-old game lesson from this game that came out a few years ago. But in Breath of the Wild, there's a few shrines where the puzzles are stupidly complex. And I think one that comes to mind is there was one where you go in, and there's this room that's split off between two sections with this wall with a door that needs to be opened, and there's all these like constellation illustrations all over the place, and you got to
Oh,
figure
I
out,
remember that one.
yeah, you got to figure it out how to match up some stuff to eventually get the door open. And the thing is, the solution's in there. It's about figuring it out. And as frustrated as I got trying to figure it out, once I did, it was like I've overcome an actual challenge.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I think,
gameplay.
yeah, and I think that,
That's the magic sauce. That's what video games are all about for
yeah,
me.
and the fear that someone might not be able to figure it out and give up isn't worth dropping some possible deep gameplay from a game.
Well, I would agree, but the thing is that gaming is just so subjective, and there are a lot of people who don't enjoy those kinds of things. Like a lot of people just play games just to relax, and
Yeah, the solution there might be the variety. Maybe there's 5 or 10 dungeons that require more complex puzzles. Maybe someone can't do it. They don't need to do that one. They can find a different one with a different challenge, whether it's combat or, put the square block in the square hole and open the door. And,
yeah.
it's,
But I think it really does speak to how successful this game was to like the non-gaming audience. That like obviously we would have liked to see more of that, but I have to imagine if it wouldn't have made this game a little a little more difficult for people
yeah, I mean,
who aren't used to that kind of stuff.
the low skill floor is absolutely a benefit in terms of that, but the problem is there's also a low skill ceiling in a lot of aspects.
Yeah.
There isn't the room to grow in it. There's no room to get more complex puzzles or more complex combat, which allows everyone to master what's there, but
Well, what we needed, I think, was Skyrim Master Quest, where it just redoes the whole game with harder puzzles.
yeah, so Nintendo needs to buy Bethesda.
Okay, now we're talking.
Yeah.
And then they can polish their games before they release them.
Nice.
It's the perfect mix.
I don't even think the puzzles need to be more complex. They should be varied. For example, there's a quest where you're going into, I think it's the Ethereum Wars, where you find the first shard of the key to the Ethereum Forge. One of the puzzles you have to get through is what they call a tonal lock, and there's this big wall, and essentially all you have to do is shoot these things with arrows in the correct order. I mean, that's not hard to do. You get punished if you mess it up, and you eventually progress if you get it right.
But it gives variety. Yeah.
It gives variety, and it's not too much to ask someone to just, I don't know, go find a bow. You probably killed somebody in this room with a bow. Just go pick it up, or just have one sitting on the floor in the room. It's simple things that they could do just to add to the variety, to the spice of
Even
life.
in the Red Eagle quest line, if you happen to somehow stumble across the second part of that, the second area before being aware of the quest, or even afterwards and just happening to find it, you walk into this open cave with a pedestal in the middle. Clearly there's something to do here, but you don't know what it is. You just know you need to find a sword or something to stick in there. And that's another puzzle, you got turned away, but it gives you this moment later where if you find it, it's like, oh damn.
It would have been cool if they like done something with the foot traps. Like, you have to step in a specific sequence in order to unlock a door or something.
Again, another thing that they could easily have done.
Oh yeah.
And there's even, there's a rudimentary physics system in this game. They could have had physics-based puzzles.
Oh no, that sounds like a gateway to.
Oh no.
The gameplay.
Okay, maybe I take that back.
Well, you know what? You're right. If this game wasn't so buggy,
If they were a
physics system, that
competent
would
physics
be-
system.
yeah, because Breath of the Wild, as you mentioned, is a game that has tons of physics-based puzzles, so it's clearly something that can be done.
And I would point out that Breath of the Wild is like the developers are on record saying that Skyrim was a major inspiration and influence in a lot of that game. So
Yeah.
you can almost see where they took what Skyrim had done and grew it a bit and fleshed some stuff out, or it shows the possibility of that type of game with those types of systems.
Absolutely.
I think
Even
part of
Elder
the
Scrolls 6.
inspiration, yeah, well, hopefully we'll see if we ever get more than just a JPEG of that.
Yeah.
But one of the big things I think you could say that Breath of the Wild took is sort of the expanse of the map and the amount of different little dungeons, if you will, that you can go into. And I think that's definitely something that was unique to Skyrim. And as soon as you start up the game and you go through the original Helgen thing, you can kind of go wherever the heck you want to. Like the map, the world is yours. Like almost right off the bat, you can just go, and you don't even have to do. You don't have to follow the guy down, whoever you decide to follow down to Riverwood. You can just go choose your spirit stone or whatever it's called, and just start kicking ass, do Daedric quests, do whatever you want.
Well, I'd like to point out you don't even have to go to the standing stones, because the first time that I played it, as soon as I had the freedom, I walked away immediately.
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of it. And like you're right, I didn't either. I mean, just you should go to the standing stones.
Well, yeah, you should. But the guy that you go with says, "Oh, we should split up," and then
Yeah.
you still follow him for a while, and then he
Well,
leads you
the
to
funniest
standing
thing,
stones.
my most recent playthrough is the only time I've ever actually followed him to Riverwood. And there's like a whole little bunch of dialogue and stuff that includes you. That's
Oh, yeah,
like
definitely.
I wouldn't like this totally went under the radar for me. And I think that's just a lot of what Skyrim is. There's a lot of stuff just going on that you just don't ever get to see because there's just so much of it.
Yeah, definitely lends into the environmental storytelling that you can clearly miss.
Yeah, I think one aspect of the game that really makes it incredible is the fact that there is so much stuff, like walking and following him, getting all of his dialogue, and fleshing out some of the story a bit, and finding the standing stones, and getting a little power boost, and then going to the town and getting a quest from there to continue on through the main storylines. That's one way to do it, but then, like Perry, if you just fuck off and ignore the main quest and
I
do
did
your own
fuck
thing,
off.
Yeah.
then
In a
you
big way.
will come across something that'll get you going in some direction. Like,
Oh,
I think
entirely.
one thing that the game does fairly well, not as well as, say, Breath of the Wild, which had the opportunity to learn from it, but just if you avoid using fast travel and you're just wandering through or walking from point A to point B, you'll almost always see something or come across something that draws your attention, like a burrow, or like a huge monument, or a sunken ship in a lake.
Especially when you realize there's like random events that happen
Yeah,
throughout
there's
your journey.
always something that'll draw your attention and get you going on some quest, whether it's super short and small or a more in-depth one. I think one, for an example, that I happened to come across was, I can't remember where I was walking to, but I was crossing this large swampy area, and I heard like something that sounded like a witch or a hag raven. So I sort of started following the noise and trying to get closer and closer, get into a little pine forest that was off to the side of the swamp area. And I see a little hut, a little shack that's clearly decorated like someone who's into some weird shit is living there. And the noises are coming from inside. I sneak around. There's a hag raven. I kill her
As you do.
as you do.
As you-
and and suddenly I'm on a Daedric quest where I have to deliver this orb to a shrine of this Daedric prince who, she had been this artifact had been taken by this NPC, and the Daedric prince talks to you through it, and this is the quest that eventually gives you a Dawnbreaker. And it's I was just
You
walking
mean
somewhere.
when another hand touches the beacon?
Yeah. And, I was just walking somewhere, and suddenly I happened on this huge quest, which was very deep, gave me some incredible moments in my playthrough, and no one told me about it. I
and
just
now you're
found it.
completely sidetracked from what you were originally doing.
Yeah, eventually I'll get back to that, but
Eventually.
yeah, the point is the game always gives you something, how big or small it is, whatever, but you almost always will find something to do naturally.
It definitely lends itself like, oh, you can play the game one way where you can just, fast travel everywhere and do quests and whatnot, or you can just, take the time to explore and
I would argue that the former there is the wrong way to play, the fast
Oh,
travel to everything.
but like again, like it's an option. Like if that's what you want to do,
It is, but it sort of alludes to the fact that why is it feel so necessary a lot of the time? In a game that
it takes so long.
well, but in a game that's well designed, you could say that there shouldn't be moments where you don't enjoy traveling from point A to point B. But, it's
I mean, that'd be a godlike game, and I wish to see the day. I don't
well,
think you
I'd
could
say
ever do
Breath of the
that with
Wild
a
was pretty close. It you
eh.
barely fast travel in that game, if at all, and the environment is interesting enough, and there's enough to discover along the way that you'd never feel like you don't want to just travel. And in my current playthrough, I've tried to avoid fast traveling as much as possible, and I'm getting way more out of the game because of it.
I think you're definitely right. I think the majority of the game should be played walking around the map exploring because, as you said, tons of stuff to do or just stumble upon. But I think that there are some times when if I'm doing a Thieves Guild quest in Riften and it tells me get to Solitude, I ain't walking.
Well, for sure. So I think a solution could have been to limit the amount of fast travel points on the map to just each of the 9 holds.
Yeah, like, so
I
that
think
you
that would
could
be
travel
fine.
to a general section and then
Well,
from
like
there, travel on
you
foot, but
can't
it
even like
also
fast travel to the cities yet until you discover them.
well, that's good, that's usually how fast travel works.
Yeah, like I remember the first time I played, it's like, oh, I had to take the carriage over to like Falk Reach. It's like, oh, now I discovered this. Now I don't have to rely on the carriage. But
Which I think might be a shame is that you suddenly don't have to use an in-game excuse to I mean, carriages are basically fast traveling.
Hmm. Well, I don't think it's something that you should remove from the game or limit. I just think, if you don't want to play that way, you're not forced to play that way. You don't have to fast
Oh,
travel.
no, absolutely. I don't think it's something that's, pushed on the player at all, but I think that if you find that players are choosing to fast travel most of the time as opposed to travel through the world, there's probably something you could have changed to make it more enjoyable to travel. Like, for example, I think horses in Skyrim are terrible.
Oh
I
yeah,
think they're
definitely
slow,
suck.
they suck to control, they
it's so
die if you
buggy.
don't, be careful, and I think that improving horses, riding mechanics in the game would have been a good way to, incentivize people to not want to just fast travel.
You telling
If
me horse armor
horses
is not enough incentive?
well, but I mean, it's like in the vanilla game, horses are barely faster than you are.
Well, what you can do is something called horse tipping, where if you tip your horse over a ledge and then I think you get off at the right angle, it shoots you way up into the sky and you can fly across
I
the map
remember
at godlike
this.
speeds.
Okay, well, clearly there's a higher skill ceiling than I thought there was, but
Yeah, no, that is some
At that point, it's like, how do I survive this?
yeah, I
that
think
is
the
some
issue is
non-trivial tech skill, man.
it's another thing that I added to my game as a mod was, better horses. Literally the name of the mod, but it improves how they feel the ride, how quick they are, how long they can sprint, making it more real a bit more realistic in terms of their stamina and a bit more enjoyable to use and
So
just
like Red Dead horse riding,
uh
No, I don't think so.
not as that depth, but like I get what you mean.
Actually, it was funny. Yesterday I was playing and I found myself thinking, "Wow, if this game was created in Red Dead Redemption in that same engine, it would be fucking incredible."
Yeah, well, I just want to go back to how we're talking about, I guess, the freedom and the exploration. And this has always been, I think, one of the greatest strengths of Bethesda's open world RPGs like Fallout 3 and Oblivion, and to a lesser extent Fallout 4, but just how they allow and also encourage the player to do whatever they want and go wherever they want, and to have that not detract from the experience that they're trying to convey. And
Mhm.
I think that's something that's really special, and it's something that Breath of the Wild, I think, emulated pretty well. Is just by rewarding the player for exploring anywhere they go, and as you say, walking between places, you're bound to be rewarded for something. And the coolest part is that at the end of the day, you'll have millions of people play this game, and not one of them will have the same story.
Yeah, I could never think of a moment where I would play this and think, "I'm not gonna follow, whichever guy I choose to follow at the beginning." And that's something that you were able to do, and that it completely changed your story of that game.
Yeah, because you could so completely join either the Imperials or the Stormcloaks, no matter who you follow. The only difference is like, oh, here's the armor for this one faction that you can get.
that you can go and forge if you wish
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you'll find forever in every other bandit camp.
by murdering them.
Yeah, that too. But another little, like you mentioned, Perry, the rewards for exploration. I wanted to actually talk about loot. I think Skyrim actually does a very good job of how it disperses loot and the actual items you're finding. In a lot of looter shooters, a lot of the time you feel like you're just picking up stuff and you're not really paying attention, or you pick up stuff that doesn't really have value. But even in even the low value items in Skyrim, if you're going through a dungeon and you're getting, 8 gold per from an urn and then some silver garnet rings that aren't worth much, by the end of the dungeon, you're finding so much little items that overall, in total, it turns into a more valuable loot when you sell it or whatever. And I think that the types of loot and the amount and how it's spread out really incentivizes you to constantly be looking for it because you're almost always going to be rewarded in some way.
Like it definitely like kind of harkens back to like the trope in like Dungeons and Dragons where like the best loot is at the end of the dungeon, but like from then until then, like you can pick up some little things here and there that just adds up in the end, unless you have a really bad DM, of course.
So yeah, I think if there weren't as good of a loot system in the game, then exploration may have ended up feeling a bit less valuable. Even if they took out the minor loot going throughout the dungeon until you get to the end and whatever chest or whatever major reward was there at the end. I think that it would have been a detriment to the game to lose the sort of menial loot that you get throughout the exploration.
So eventually it kind of gets repetitive because then you start realizing like at the very end it's like, oh, here's a great axe with X enchantment. Like it's like that bit of RNG in there.
I will agree that the looting does sometimes feel pretty repetitive, and I'm someone that's like quite neurotic with like having to check every urn for like four
Yes.
pieces
Oh
of
yeah.
gold, and that's definitely like a failing on my part. But it's like when they're rewarding me for checking every urn, it's like I have this impulse to keep
You're
doing
gonna
it,
keep
even though I
checking
don't
every
really
urn.
want to do it.
And the only hurdle with that is like, oh, can I carry all of this stuff by the end of this? What am I gonna
Yeah.
have to drop? Unless you're like me, where you just pump stamina all the way up.
One way they could have improved the loot system in the game was I actually found early on in my playthrough that a lot of the time the loot didn't make sense for the container it was in. And, you'd be finding food in a drawer, it's just something was off.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
don't keep bread in
something
your drawer?
yeah, somewhere with some stuff and it would be like, "Huh, that's weird that that was in there." Or I think another issue I was having is and, this might have been a intended interaction, but you eventually stop finding many potions throughout the world, and, maybe it's a means for you to start crafting them yourselves, but I never got much into it. And, I will say that I eventually did add a mod that improved how loot was dispersed a bit about halfway into the playthrough, but just the difference in how it felt by just changing some locations for where certain things would be found, like food always being found in barrels and sacks as opposed to in a chest or something, and, potions happening to be in urns, maybe someone died and you put a potion of health in with some gold, maybe they'll do better next time you're back. But, it ended up feeling better, so while I think the base game does do it well, I think there was still lots of room for improvement in that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Well, do you want to talk about maybe we'll cap off the gameplay here, Cam, if you want to talk about your thoughts on the difficulty?
Sure. So Skyrim kind of implements a similar difficulty that a lot of games do, where it's the same gameplay. You just have a health and damage multiplier, which can be effective. Sometimes all an enemy needs to feel more difficult is to have more health and deal more damage. But I think the problem comes in where it doesn't get properly dispersed around the map. Like we said earlier, you can go wherever you want to in the beginning of the game. And most of the areas around Helgen are, you're fine to go in wherever. It's mostly just normal bandits. But if you start to venture north before you're ready to, you get absolutely slapped around. And in a different way, you can head north when you're ready to, and then come back south, and then all the enemies die in one hit. Or if you're going through and you're leveling things that don't pertain to combat, but you're still up to level 30, but let's say, you main two-handed weapons and heavy
You have
armor, and you've
100 in
only
smithing.
yeah, exactly. That sort of thing. So you've gotten to level 30, but you've only got like a couple points into extra two-handed damage and like maybe 1 point into extra heavy armor. The enemies feel like they're totally overbearing because they're leveled as if you've been leveling combat stats. So they feel like it feels like the difficulty isn't quite spread around as it should be.
Yeah, I'm guessing they're not expecting players to like hard farm in that way, but I guess it is, I guess, frustrating to get punished for doing it.
Isn't like Bethesda games like known to have like really kind of ridiculous high difficulty?
Well, sometimes it's just you'll stumble upon a Draugr Deathlord and you can't kill them. There's no amount of potions you can pump into yourself, no amount of buffs you can put on yourself to even get through the counter. And it won't even be the final like dungeon boss, which is just kind of frustrating. Especially when you can encounter them at the beginning of the dungeon and then everyone else in the dungeon you'll just one shot and you'll walk right through it.
Yeah, the game in a lot of situations almost it encourages you. I mean, not intentionally, but the way that it's implemented encourages you to basically freaking cheese the
Oh, all the
combat
time.
encounter. So, you just take advantage of an exploit somehow that I think unintentionally actually yesterday when I was playing, I came across a Death Lord and it was in a room where if you walked in, there was two towers that would shoot fireballs at you, and then he would be in the middle and he would come and attack you once he detected you. And I'm playing a stealth archer as you do, and and so I try to sneak around and I try and like shoot an arrow in the middle, see if you'll like come over to look. And eventually he detects me, but instead of coming at me, he just sort of starts walking around the room, like looking for me still. And I was just standing in a doorway at like sort of the entrance to this chamber. And so I'm like, yeah, I could step out there and, turn this into the encounter it was probably intended to be, or I could just win and keep shooting this guy as he wanders
Just teasing.
around wondering what's going on.
Which is probably why archery is the most popular way to deal with the enemies,
Yeah.
because you actually deal damage, and there's a chance that you don't even have to really fight them at all.
Yeah, so I end up killing him. I skipped that whole intended experience and I got the reward for it. And so, you know, as much as that worked out for me, I don't think it's good that that's in the game. I think I missed out because of choosing to do that. And the argument where, well, you chose to do that. Well, yeah, but
But it was presented to me like,
yeah, if someone says you can get this reward and get slapped, or get this reward and not get slapped, why pick the former?
Well, sometimes I just want to get slapped, okay?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't kink shame, but I think part of this comes from the open nature of the map. It's very difficult to tell where players would go, and therefore it's difficult to make some areas more difficult than others without just having everything scale and be the same difficulty across the board.
And again, like it also goes back to like it's a single player game. You play however you want to play. If you want to play it on easy mode, air quotes on easy, that's completely up to you. That
Well,
freedom
I
of
think
choice.
one way that they do increase difficulty with some of the enemies, like some of the more advanced Draugr, were like Death Lords being able to use shouts. I thought that was a great
Oh
inclusion.
gosh.
That suddenly they're using one of your abilities against you, and you have to figure out how to deal with it. And they'll have different types of shouts or whatever, depending on who it was.
Getting
But
yeeted across the room.
Yeah, I
yeah,
think it can be a good addition, except for when there's like two or three of them, and you're getting chain rodad across the fucking.
God.
And it takes forever to get up. You can't see your health bar, and you just die while you watch your guy try to stand up like he's a
this is the
paraplegic.
intended
Well,
experience.
especially because what's the counterplay there? Like, don't get shouted at? Like,
You shout back at them.
I literally have to like open up the menu to check my health to see if I'm gonna die while my guy is standing up.
Yeah, I mean that becomes an issue of design as opposed to the abilities. They put too many without accounting for how this was gonna affect the combat experience. I think, yeah, in a one-on-one experience, it's great, or a one-on-one with a bunch of minor enemies around.
Yeah, and in a similar way as you get up to the higher difficulties, like Draugr Whites, for example, will summon Frost Atronachs, which it's not hugely difficult, but it adds like a different layer to it.
Yeah.
Adds more noise. Now you gotta deal with these guys.
I will say though, when it comes to selecting a difficulty, I often find myself starting at harder difficulties, and as I'm playing through the game, I'll just lower that down because I'm like, the gameplay loop becomes a little more tiring, and I'm gonna get even more exhausted if it takes, 15 swings on this guy instead of 7. So I'll just lower it down for my own. It's like my own sanity, you know.
Yeah, the gameplay is not well suited to just pumping up the numbers for the sake of difficulty. Like it doesn't really work here.
Well, it doesn't add anything other than it just lengthens it lengthens the encounter without changing it at all.
Yeah, I think the issue is a lot of the time it does come down to these more difficult enemies being stronger, like more health, and the hits don't hurt them as much and they hit harder. And well, that's a good way I think to show that you're underleveled. I think the issue is that you're able to take advantage of different mechanics to get through it anyways. Whether it's pausing the game, drinking a 2 liter of health potion real quick, or,
Let me just
eating
chug
your
this down.
entire food menu within 10 seconds. The game gives you enough ways to get around the intended difficulty, which ends up making it feel like you're just spending way too long in combat and you're chipping this guy's health down where it should have been, I can't beat this guy. I need to get stronger and then come back
Yeah.
almost.
It's just I'm cheesing this guy. Why don't I just make it easier so I actually just experience the combat and just
Yeah.
get through it faster?
Yeah, I think there's a little too much flipping around in menus mid combat.
Yeah.
That's not what you want.
Whoa, I gotta
Quick,
bring up the
quick,
favorite
big
menu again.
shout out. Yeah, I was just gonna say big, quick shout out to the favorites menu, which is actually a pretty brilliant inclusion.
Oh yeah.
It obviously meant to cut down on the amount of menu scrolling you do mid fight, but still, the amount of different options you have, you can't possibly put everything in the favorites menu.
Especially when you're transitioning from like bow to sword to like spells. Just like right there. Easy.
Well, part of me wonders if they didn't mean for you to even equip different armor sets for different encounters. Because
It seems
sometimes it
that way.
feels like the only like certain Draugr have way too much health that you're not going to burn through them with spells before you're out of mana, and then like you're just going to run around or drink potions till you
I
get
think
bored.
it's definitely intentional because you get plenty of enchanted items that are, a shield that gives you plus 20% resistance to frost, or one that gives you, plus 20% resistant to fire, and that, you'll have boots with the same, or, gauntlets that give you better one-handed or two-handed, or, hand coverings that give you better ranged. I think it definitely is intended for you to
Yeah,
go
well,
in
even just at
and
a
change it
simple
out.
level, not based on resistances, just going from stuff that allows you to cast spells to, oh crap, now I'm out of mana. Let's switch to some heavy armor and let's get in there.
Yeah.
Which I mean is a thought, but at the same time, having like 50 weight in heavy armor in your inventory, it kind of sucks.
Yeah, it definitely feels intentional almost, but whether it's a good mechanic is arguable.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's a good point to wrap on. So thanks everyone for listening to part one of our talk on Skyrim. You can tune in for part two, where we will be discussing the game's story and presentation aspects.